Hello everyone! I hope you're ready for another adventure, because today Wayne continues to read Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. Always remember that as we go through these amazing stories and read these outstanding adventures, all you have to do is press the CC button in your YouTube link in order to follow along with the words. Now I think that Bumblebee will be perfect to join us for today's adventure. Now that Bumblebee's here, let's jump in. Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Chapter 9, Grim Defeat. Professor Dumbledore sent all the Gryffindors back to the Great Hall, where they had joined 10 minutes later by the students from Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, who all seemed extremely confused. The teachers and I need to conduct a thorough search of the castle, Professor Dumbledore told them, as Professors McGonagall and Flitwick closed all the doors into the hall. I'm afraid that, for your own safety, you'll need to spend the night here. I want the prefects to stand guard over the entrances to the hall, and I am leaving head boy and girl in charge. Any disturbance should be reported to me immediately. He handed to Percy, who was looking immensely proud and important. Send word with one of the ghosts. Professor Dumbledore paused about leaving the hall. Oh yes, you'll be needing one casual wave of his wand, and the long tables flew to the edges of the hall and stood themselves against the wall. Another wave, and the floor was covered with hundreds of squashy purple sleeping bags. Sleep well, said Professor Dumbledore, closing the door behind them. The hall immediately began to buzz excitedly. The Gryffindors were telling the rest of the school what had just happened. Everyone into their sleeping bags, shouted Percy. Come on now. No more talking. Lights out in 10 minutes. Come on, Ron said to Harry and Hermione. They seized 3 sleeping bags and dragged them into the corner. Do you think Black's still in the castle? Hermione whispered anxiously. Dumbledore obviously thinks he might be, said Ron. It's very lucky he picked tonight, you know, said Hermione as they climbed fully dressed into their sleeping bags and propped themselves on their elbows to talk. The one night we weren't in the tower. I reckon he's lost track of time being on the run, said Ron. Didn't realize it was Halloween. Otherwise, he'd come bursting in here. Hermione shuddered. All around them, people were asking one another the same question. How did he get in? Maybe he knows how to apparat, said a Ravenclaw a few feet away. Just appear out of thin air, you know. Disguise himself, probably, said a Hufflepuff 5th year. He could have flown, suggested Dean Thomas. Obviously, am I the only person who's ever bothered to read Hogwarts a history? Said Hermione, crossed to Harry and Ron. Probably, said Ron. Why? Because the castle's protected by more than walls, you know, said Hermione. There are all sorts of enchantments on it to stop people entering by stealth. You can't just apparat in here. And I'd like to see the disguise that could fool those Dementors. They're guarding every single entrance to the grounds. They'd have to fly in too, and Filch knows all the secret passages. They'll have them covered. The lights are going out now, Percy shouted. I want everyone in their sleeping bags, and no more talking. The candles went out at once. The only light now came from the silvery ghosts that were drifting about, talking seriously to the prefects in the enchanted ceiling, which, like the sky outside, was scattered with stars. What with that, and the whispering that still filled the hall, Harry felt as though he were sleeping outdoors in the light wind. Once every hour, a teacher would reappear to the hall and check that everything was quiet. Around 3 in the morning, when many of the students had finally fallen asleep, Professor Dumbledore came in. Harry watched him looking around for Percy, who had been prowling between sleeping bags, telling people off for talking. Percy was only the short way away from Harry and Ron and Hermione, who quickly pretended to be asleep as Dumbledore's footsteps drew nearer. Any sign of him, Professor? Asked Percy in a whisper. No, all well here. Everything under control, sir. Good, there's no point in moving them all out now. I found a temporary guardian for the Gryffindor portrait. You'll be able to move them back in tomorrow. And the fat lady, sir? Hiding in the map of Algashir on the 2nd floor. Apparently, she refused to let Black in without the password, so he attacked. She's still very distressed. But once she's calmed down, I'll have Mr. Filch restore her. Harry heard the door to the hall crack open again, and Moore's footsteps. Headmaster, it was Snape. Harry kept quite still, listening hard. The whole of the 3rd floor has been searched. He's not there. And Filch has done the dungeons. Nothing there either. What about the astronomy tower, Professor Trelawney's room? The owlery? All searched. Very well, Severus. I didn't expect Black to linger. Have you any theory as to how he got in, Professor? Asked Snape. Harry raised his head, very slightly off his arms, in order to free his other ear. Many, Severus. Each of them as unlikely as the next. Harry opened his eyes a fraction and squinted up to see where they stood. Dumbledore's back was to him, but he could see Percy's face, rapt with attention, and Snape's profile, which looked angry. You remember the conversation we had, Headmaster, just before? The start of the term, said Snape, who was barely opening his lips, as though trying to block Percy out of the conversation. "I do," said Dumbledore, and there was something like warning in his voice. "Seems almost impossible that Black could have entered the school without inside help. I did express my concerns when you appointed. I do not believe a single person inside this castle would have helped Black enter," said Dumbledore, and his tone made it so clear that the subject was closed that Snape didn't reply. "I must go down to the Dementors," said Dumbledore. "I said I would inform them when our search was complete." "Didn't they want to help, sir?" said Percy. "Oh yes," said Dumbledore coldly, "but I'm afraid no Dementor will cross the threshold of this castle while I'm headmaster." Percy looked slightly abashed. Dumbledore left the hall, walking quickly and quietly. Snape stood for a moment, watching the headmaster with an expression of deep resentment in his face. Then he too left. Harry glanced sideways at Ron and Hermione. Both of them had their eyes open too, reflecting the starry ceiling. "What was that about?" Ron mouthed. "The school talked of nothing but Sirius Black for the next few days. The theories about how he entered the castle became wilder and wilder. Hannah Abbott from Hufflepuff spent much of their next herbology class telling everyone who'd listened that Black could turn into a flowering shrub. The fat lady's ripped canvas had been taken off the wall and replaced with the portrait of Sir Cardigan and his fat gray pony. No one was very happy about this. Sir Cardigan spent half his time challenging people to duels, and the rest thinking up ridiculously complicated passwords, which he changed at least twice a day. "He's a complete lunatic," said Seamus Finnegan angrily to Percy. "Can't we get anyone else?" "None of the other pictures wanted this job," said Percy, frightened about what happened to the fat lady. Sir Cadogan was the only one brave enough to volunteer. Sir Cadogan, however, was the least of Harry's worries. He was now being closely watched. Teachers found excuses to walk along with him to corridors, and Percy Weasley, acting, Harry suspected, on his mother's orders, was tailing him everywhere like an extremely pompous guard dog. To cap it off, Professor McGonagall summoned Harry to her office. With such a somber expression on her face, Harry thought someone must have died. "There's no point in hiding it from you any longer, Potter," she said in a very serious point. "I know this will come as a shock to you about Sirius Black." "I know he's after me," said Harry Weasley. "I heard Ron's dad telling his mom. Mr. Weasley works in the Ministry of Magic." Mr. McGonagall seemed to be taken aback. She stared at Harry for a moment and then said, "I see. Well, in that case, Potter, you'll understand why I don't think it's a good idea for you to be practicing Quidditch in the evenings out on the field with only your teammates. It's very exposed, Potter." "We've got our first match on Saturday," said Harry, outraged. "I've got to train, Professor." Professor McGonagall considered him intently. Harry knew she was deeply interested in Gryffindor's team prospect. It had been she, after all, who'd suggested him as a seeker in the first place. He waited, holding his breath. Professor McGonagall stood up and stared out the window at the Quidditch field, just visible through the rain. "Well, goodness knows, I'd like to see us win the cup at last. But all the same, Potter, I'd be much happier if a teacher were present. I'll ask Madame Hooch to oversee your training sessions." The weather worsened steadily as the first Quidditch match drew near. Undaunted, the Gryffindor team was training harder than ever under the eye of Madame Hooch. Then, at their final training session, before Saturday's match, Oliver Wood gave the team some unwelcome news. "We're not playing Slytherin," he told them, looking very angry. "Flint's just been to see me. We're playing Hufflepuff instead." "Why?" chorused the rest of the team. "Flint's excuse is that their seeker's arm is still injured," said Wood, grinding his teeth fiercely. "But it's obviously why they're doing it. They don't want to play in this weather. Think it'll damage their chances." There had been strong winds and heavy rain all day, and as Wood spoke, they heard a distant rumble of thunder. "There's nothing wrong with Malfoy's arm," said Harry furiously. "He's faking it." "I know that, but we can't prove it," said Wood bitterly. "And we've been practicing all our moves assuming we're playing Slytherin, but instead it's Hufflepuff, and their style's quite different. They've got a new captain and seeker, Cedric Diggory." Angelina, Alicia, and Katie suddenly giggled. "What?" said Wood, frowning in his light-hearted behavior. "He's that tall, good-looking one, isn't he?" said Angelina. "Strong and silent," said Katie, and they started to giggle again. "He's only silent because he's too thick to string two words together," said Fred impatiently. "I don't know why we're worried. Oliver Hufflepuff is a pushover. Last time we played them, Harry caught the snitch in 5 minutes, remember?" "We were playing in completely different conditions," Wood shouted, his eyes bulging slightly. "Diggory's put a very strong side together. He's an excellent seeker. I was afraid you'd take it like this. We mustn't relax. We must keep our focus. Slytherin is trying to wrong-foot us. We must win." "Oliver, calm down," said Fred, looking slightly alarmed. "We're taking Hufflepuff very seriously." Seriously. The day before the match, the winds reached a howling point, and the rain fell harder than ever. It was so dark inside the corridors of the classrooms that extra torches and lanterns were lit. The Slytherin team was looking very smug indeed, and none of them more so than Malfoy. Only my arm was feeling a bit better, he sighed, as the gales outside pounded the windows. Harry had no room in his head to worry about anything except the match tomorrow. Oliver Wood kept hurrying up to him between classes and giving him tips. The third time this happened, Wood talked for so long that Harry suddenly realized he was 10 minutes late for Defense Against the Dark Arts, and set off in a run with Wood shouting after him. "Diggory's got a fast swerve, Harry, so you might want to try looping him." Harry skidded to a halt outside the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, pulled the door open, and dashed inside. "Sorry I'm late, Professor Lupin, But it wasn't Professor Lupin who looked up at Harry from the teacher's desk. It was Snape. "This lesson began 10 minutes ago, Potter, so I think we'll make it 10 points from Gryffindor. Sit down." But Harry didn't move. "Where's Professor Lupin?" he said. "He says he's feeling too ill to teach today," said Snape with a twisted smile. "I believe I told you to sit down." But Harry stayed where he was. "What's wrong with him?" Snape's black eyes glinted. "Nothing life-threatening," he said, looking as though he wished it were. 5 more points from Gryffindor, and I'll have to ask you to sit again. It will be 50. Harry walked slowly to his seat and sat down. Snape looked around at the class. "As I was saying before Potter interrupted, Professor Lupin has not left any record of the topics that you have covered so far." "Please, sir, we've done Bogarts, Redcaps, Kappas, Grindybows," said Hermione quickly, "and we were just about to start." "Be quiet," said Snape coldly. "I did not ask for information. I was merely commenting on Professor Lupin's lack of organization." "He's the best Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher we've ever had," said Dean Thomas boldly, and there was a murmur of agreement in the rest of the class. Snape looked more menacing than ever. "You are easily satisfied. Lupin is hardly overtaxing you. I would expect first years to be able to deal with Redcaps and Grindylows. Today's lesson shall discuss." Harry watched him flick through the textbook to the very back of the chapter, which he must know they hadn't covered. "Werewolves," said Snape. "But sir," said Hermione, seemingly unable to restrain herself, "we're not supposed to do werewolves yet. We're due to start Hinky Puffs." "Miss Granger," said Snape, in a voice of deeply calm, "I was under the impression that I am teaching this lesson, not you, and I am telling you all to turn to page 394. He glanced around again. "All of you, now!" With many bitter sidelong looks and some sullen muttering, the class opened their books. "Which of you can tell me how to distinguish between a werewolf and a true wolf?" said Snape. Everyone sat motionless in silence. Everyone except Hermione, whose hand, as often did, had shot straight up into the air. "Anyone," said Snape, ignoring Hermione with a twisted smile. "Are you telling me Professor Lupin hasn't even taught you the basic distinction between—" "We told you," said Perfidi suddenly. "We haven't gotten that far as werewolves yet. We're still on—" "Silence," snarled Snape. Well. I never had thought I'd meet a third-year class who didn't know how to recognize a werewolf when they saw one." "Please, sir," said Hermione, whose hand was still in the air. "The werewolf differs from the true wolf in several small ways. The snout of the werewolf—" "That is the second time you have spoken out of turn, Miss Granger," said Snape coolly. 5 more points from Gryffindor for being insufferable know-it-all." Hermione went red, put down her hand, and stared at the fool with her eyes full of tears. It was a mark of how much the class loathed Snape that they were all glaring at him, because every one of them had called Hermione a know-it-all at least once, and Ron, who told Hermione that she was a know-it-all at least twice a week, said loudly, "You asked us a question and she knows the answer. Why ask if you don't want to be told?" The class knew instantly he'd gone too far. Snape advanced on Ron slowly, and the room held its breath. "Detention, Weasley," Snape said silkily, his face very close to Ron's, "and if I ever hear you criticize the way I teach class again, you will be very sorry indeed." No one made a sound throughout the rest of the lesson. They sat and made notes on werewolves from the textbook, while Snape prowled up and down the row of desks, examining the work they had been doing with Professor Lupin. "Poorly explained. That is incorrect. The Kappa is more commonly found in Mongolia." Professor Lupin gave his 8 out of 10. I would have given it a 3. When the bell rang at last, Snape held them back. "You will each write an essay to be handed in to me on the ways you recognize and kill werewolves. I want 2 rolls of parchment on the subject, and I want them by Monday morning. It is time someone took this class in the hand. Weasley, stay behind. We need to arrange your detention." Harry and Hermione left the room with the rest of the class, who waited until they were out of the earshot and then burst into furious tirade about Snape. "Snape's never been like this with any of the other Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers, even if they wanted the job," Harry said to Hermione. "Why's he got it out for Lupin? Do you think this is because of the Bogart?" "I don't know," said Hermione pensively, "but I really hope Professor Lupin gets well soon." Ron caught up with them 5 minutes later in a towering rage. "You know what that," he called Professor Snape, something that made Hermione say, "Ron," "is making me do? I've got to scrub out the deadpans in the hospital wing without magic." He was breathing deeply with clenched fists. Why couldn't Black have hidden in Snape's office, hey? He could have finished him off for us. Harry woke extremely early the next morning. So early, it was still dark. For a moment, he thought the roaring winds had woken him. Then he felt a cold breeze on the back of his neck and sat bolt upright. Peeves the poltergeist had been floating next to him, blowing in his ear. What are you doing that for? Said Harry furiously. Peeves puffed out his cheeks, blew hard, and zoomed backwards out of the room, cackling. Harry fumbled for his alarm and looked at it. It was 4:30. Cursing Peeves, he rolled over and tried to get back to sleep. But it was difficult, now that he was awake, to ignore the sounds of the thunder rumbling over, the pounding of the wind in the castle walls, the distant creaking of the trees in the forbidden forest. In a few hours, he would be out on the Quidditch field, battling through the gale. Finally, he gave up any thought of more sleep, got up and got dressed, picked up his Nimbus 2000, and walked quietly out of the dormitory. As he opened the door, something brushed against his leg. He bent down just in time to grab Crookshanks by the end of the bushy tail and drag him outside. You know, I reckon Ron was right about you, Harry told Crookshanks suspiciously. There are plenty of mice around this place. Go and chase them, go on, he added, nudging Crookshanks down the spiral staircase with his foot. Leave Scabbers alone. The noise of the storm was even louder in the common room. Harry knew better than to think that the match would be cancelled. Quidditch matches weren't called off for trifles like thunderstorms. Nevertheless, he was starting to feel very apprehensive. Wood had pointed out Cedric Diggory to him. Diggory was a 5th year and a lot bigger than Harry. Seekers are usually light and speedy, but Diggory's weight would be an advantage in this weather because he was less likely to get blown off course. Harry whiled away the hours in dawn in front of the fire, getting up every now and then to stop Crookshanks from sneaking up the boys' staircase again. At long last, Harry thought it might be time for breakfast, so he headed to the portrait hole alone. Stand and fight, you mangy cur, said Sir Cadogan. Oh, shut up, Harry yawned. He revived a bit over a bowl of porridge, and by the time he started on the toast, the rest of the team had turned up. It's going to be a tough one, said Wood, who wasn't eating anything. Stop worrying, Oliver, said Alicia soothingly. We don't mind a bit of rain. But it was considerably more than a bit of rain. Such was the popularity of Quidditch that the whole school turned out to watch matches as usual, but they ran down the lawns towards a Quidditch field, heads bowed against the furious ones, umbrellas whipping out of their hands as they went. Just before they entered the locker room, Harry saw Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle laughing and pointing at him from under an enormous umbrella on their way to the stadium. The team changed into their scarlet robes and waited for Wood's usual pre-match pep talk, but it didn't come. He tried to speak several times, made an odd gulping noise, and then shook his head hopelessly and beckoned them to follow. The wind was so strong that they staggered sideways as they walked onto the field. If the crowd was cheering, they couldn't hear it over the rolls of thunder. Rain was splattering against Harry's glasses. How on earth was he going to see the snitch in this? The Hufflepuffs were approaching from the opposite direction of the pitch, wearing their canary yellow robes. The captains walked to each other and shook hands. Diggory smiled at Wood, and Wood now looked as though he had lockjaw and merely nodded. Harry saw Madame Hooch's mouth form the words, "Mount your brooms!" He pulled his right foot on the mud and with a squelch and swung it over the Nimbus 2000. Madame Hooch put her whistle to her lips, gave it a blast, and sounded her shrill in the distance. They were off. Harry rose fast, but his Nimbus was swerving slightly in the wind. He held it as steadily as he could and turned, squinting into the rain. Within 5 minutes, Harry was soaked to his skin and frozen, hardly able to see his teammates, let alone the tiny snitch. He flew backwards and forwards across the field, past blurred and red and yellow shapes, with no idea what was happening the rest of the game. He couldn't hear the commentary over the wind. The crowd was hidden beneath a sea of cloaks and battered umbrellas. Twice, Harry came very close to being unseated by a Bulger. His vision was so clouded by the rain on his glasses, he hadn't seen them coming. He lost track of time. It was getting harder and harder to move his broom straight. The sky was getting darker, as though the night decided to come early. Twice, Harry nearly hit another player without knowing whether it was a teammate or an opponent. Everyone was so wet now and the rain was so thick, he could hardly tell them apart. With the first flash of lightning came the sound of Madame Hooch's whistle. Harry could see the outline of Wood through the thick rain gesturing him to the ground. The whole team splashed down into the mud. "I called for a timeout," Wood roared to his team. "Come on, under here." They huddled at the edge of the field under a large umbrella. Harry took off his glasses and wiped them hurriedly under the robe. "What's the score?" "We're up 50 points, said Wood, "but unless we get the snitch, we'll be playing into the night." "I've got no chance with these on," said Harry, exhaustedly waving his glasses. At that moment, Hermione appeared at his shoulder. She was holding her cloak over her head and was impeccably beaming. "I have an idea, Harry. Give me your glasses, quick." He handed them over to her, and as the team watched in her amazement, she tapped them with her wand and said, "Impervious." There, she said, handing them back to Harry. They'll repel any water. Wood looked as though he could have kissed her. Brilliant, he called out hoarsely after her as she disappeared into the crowd. Okay, team, let's go for it. Hermione's spell did the trick. Harry was still numb with cold, still wetter than he'd ever been in his life, but he could see. Full of fresh determination, he urged his broom through the turbulent air, staring in every direction for the snitch, avoiding a bludgeon, ducking beneath Diggory, who was still streaking in the opposite direction. There was another clap of thunder, followed immediately by forked lightning. This was getting more and more dangerous. Harry needed to get the snitch quickly. Harry saw something that distracted him completely, the silhouette of an enormous shaggy black dog, clearly imprinted against the sky, motionless in the topmost empty row of the seats. Harry's numb hand slipped from the broom's handle, and his nimbus dropped a few feet, shaking his sodden bags out of his eyes. He squinted back to the stands. The dog had vanished. "Harry!" came Wood's anguished yell from the Gryffindor goalpost. "Harry, behind you!" Harry looked around wildly. Cedric Diggory was pelting up the field, with a tiny speck of gold was shimmering in the rain-filled air between them. With a jolt of panic, Harry threw himself flat in broom handle and zoomed quickly toward the snitch. "Come on," he growled as Nimbus 2000 in the rain whipped his face. Faster! But something odd was happening. An eerie silence was falling across the stadium. The wind was stronger as ever and was forgetting the war. It was as though someone had turned off the sound, as though Harry had gone completely deaf. What was going on? And then a horrible familiar wave of cold swept over him, inside the field, just as he became aware of something moving below. Before he'd come to think of it, Harry had taken his eyes off the snitch and looked down. At least 100 Dementors, their faces pointing up at him, were standing beneath him. It was as though the freezing water were raising in his chest, cutting in his insides. And then he heard it again. Someone was screaming inside his head, a woman. "Not Terry! Not Terry! Please, not Terry! Stand alone, you silly girl! Stand aside now! Not Terry! Please no! Take me! Kill me instead!" Numbing, swirling white mist was filling Harry's brain. What was he doing? Was he flying? He needed to help her. She was going to die. She was going to be murdered. He was falling through the icy mist. "Not Harry! Please, have mercy, have mercy!" A shrill voice was laughing, a woman screaming, and Harry knew no more. Lucky the ground was so soft. I thought he was dead for sure, but he didn't even break his glasses. Harry could hear the voices whispering. They had made no sense whatsoever. He didn't have a clue where he was, or how he got there, or what he'd been doing before he got there. All he knew was that every inch of him was aching as though he had been beaten. The scariest thing, hooded black figures, cold, screaming. Harry's eyes snapped open. He was lying in the hospital wing. The Gryffindor team, splattered with mud head to foot, was gathered around his bed. Ron and Hermione were also there, looking as though they had just climbed out of a swimming pool. "Harry," said Fred, who was extremely white underneath the mud. "How are you feeling?" It was as though Harry's memory was on fast forward. The lightning, the grim, the snitch, the Dementors. "What happened?" he said, sitting up, and suddenly they all gasped. "You fell off," said Fred. "You must have been, 50 feet? We thought you died," said Alicia, who was shaking. Hermione, who was a small, creaky voice, her eyes were extremely bloodshot. "But the match," said Harry. "What happened? Are we going to replay?" No one said anything. The horrible truth sunk into Harry like a stone. "We didn't lose." "Diggory got the snitch," said George, "just after you fell. He didn't realize what happened. When he looked back and saw you on the ground, he tried to call it off, wanted a rematch, but they won fair and square. Even Wood admits it." "Where is Wood?" said Harry, suddenly realizing he wasn't there. "Still in the shower," said Fred. "We think he's going to drown himself." Harry put his face to his knees, his hands gripping the air. Fred grabbed his shoulder and shook it roughly. "Come on, Harry, you've never missed the snitch before." "There had to be one time you didn't get it," said George. "It's not over yet," said Fred. "We lost by 100 points, right? So if Hufflepuff loses the Ravenclaw, and we beat Ravenclaw and Slytherin, Hufflepuff will have to at least lose by 200 points, said George. "But if they beat Ravenclaw, no way, Ravenclaw is too good. But if Slytherin loses against Hufflepuff, it all depends on the points, a margin of 100 either way." Harry lay there, not saying a word. They had lost. For the first time ever, he had lost the Quidditch match. After 10 minutes or so, Madame Pomfrey came over to tell the team to leave him in peace. "We'll come see you later," Fred told him. "Don't beat yourself up, Harry. You're still the best seeker we've ever had." The team trotted out, trailing mud behind them. Madame Pomfrey shut the door behind him, looking disapprovingly. Ron and Hermione moved nearer to Harry's bed. "Dumbledore was really angry," Hermione said in a quaking voice. "I've never seen him like that before. He ran onto the field as you fell, waved his wand, and you sort of slowed down before you hit the ground. Then he whirled his wand at the Dementors, shot silver stuff at them. They left the stadium right away. He was furious they'd come onto the grounds. We'd hurt him. Then they magicked you onto a stretcher," Ron said, "and walked you up to the school with you floating on it. Everyone thought you were." His face faded, but Harry hardly noticed. He was thinking about what the Dementors had done to him, about the screaming voice. He looked up and saw Ron and Hermione looking at him anxiously. Then he quickly cast around for something matter-of-fact to say. Did someone get my Nimbus? Ron and Hermione looked at him. What? What? Said Harry, looking from one to the other. Well, when you fell off, it got blown away, said Hermione hesitantly. And it hit. Oh, Harry, it hit the Whopping Willow. Harry's inside lurched. The Whomping Willow is a very violent tree that stood alone in the middle of the grounds. And he said, dreading the answer, well, you know the Whomping Willow, said Ron, and it doesn't like being hit. Professor Flitwick brought it back just before you came around, said Hermione in a very small voice. Slowly, she reached around for a bag at her feet, turned it upside down, and tipped a dozen bits of splintered woods and twigs onto the bed, the only remnants of Harry's faithful, finely beaten broomstick. Oh, wow. A lot of crazy things happened in today's adventures. What did you think, Bumblebee? I'm glad he ended up okay, too. We'll see you in the next adventure, okay? And we'll see you in the next adventure, here with Wayne Reeves. Thank you for joining us, and we can't wait to see you again. Bye-bye!